Deep in the Wyoming highlands, a 15-year-old boy named Sile ran through the frozen night with nothing but the clothes on his back and a heart full of fear. He had escaped from the state orphanage, where cruelty wore a caretaker's face. But freedom in the dead of winter was its own kind of prison. Stumbling through a blizzard, half frozen and certain he would die alone, he saw it. The silhouette of an old ranch house rising from the snow like a ghost from another time. The place had been abandoned for years, its windows dark and its fences broken. But as Sile pushed through the creaking door seeking shelter from the storm, he found something impossible. Fresh boot prints in the dust, the faint smell of coffee, a dog's distant bark echoing from somewhere deep within the property. Someone was living here in secret, but who hides on an abandoned ranch? And why would they let a runaway boy discover their refuge? The air inside Mountain View State Orphanage was thick with the smell of industrial cleaner, boiled cabbage, and something darker that Sile had learned to recognize over his 7 years within its walls. Fear. It clung to the faded yellow paint of the corridors, settled into the threadbare carpet of the common room, and lived in the eyes of every child who passed through Director Harlan's domain. Tyle was 15 years old, tall and lean, with dark hair that fell across watchful hazel eyes, and he had survived this place by learning to be invisible, by keeping his head down and his mouth shut. But invisibility could only protect you from so much, and today, on this grey November afternoon, he had been forced to watch something that shattered the fragile armor he had built around his heart. 8-year-old Tommy, a small boy with a persistent stutter and a habit of wetting the bed, had accidentally spilled juice during lunch. It was nothing, a simple mistake born of trembling hands, but Director Harlan had descended on the child like a vengeful storm. The man was in his 50s, broad-shouldered and thick around the middle, with a face that might have been handsome once, but had curdled into something cruel, his small dark eyes always searching for weakness to exploit. He had grabbed Tommy by the collar, lifting the sobbing child off his feet, and before anyone could move or breathe, he had struck the boy across the face with an open palm, the crack of it echoing through the dining hall like a gunshot. The other children had frozen, forks halfway to mouths, their faces blank masks they had all learned to wear. Tyle's hands had clenched into fists beneath the table, his entire body vibrating with impotent rage, but he had forced himself to remain still, to swallow the words that burned in his throat. Then Harlan had turned those cold eyes on Sile, and spoken the words that sealed everything. "You've been getting too comfortable, Callahan. You and that little friend of yours, Ethan. I think it's time we separated you two. Ethan's getting transferred to the facility in Casper next week." Ethan was the only person in this hellish place who felt like family, a 13-year-old boy with bright red hair and a laugh that could make even the darkest days bearable. And the thought of losing him, of being completely alone again, was a terror Sile could not face. Something fundamental broke inside him in that moment, a dam that had been holding back years of accumulated grief and rage and desperate longing for something more than this existence. As the afternoon bled into evening, as the routines of medication distribution and forced recreation and lights out proceeded with their usual grim efficiency, Sile made his decision with a clarity that felt like cold water closing over his head. He would run. He packed a small backpack with stolen supplies from the kitchen, 3 cans of soup, a box of crackers, a bottle of water, a lighter he had found in the maintenance closet. He waited until the night shift change at 11, when Mrs. Patterson left and Mr. Gomez arrived, those precious 7 minutes when the basement door was unwatched. His heart hammered against his ribs as he slipped down the concrete stairs, as he forced open the narrow window that led to the outside world, as he squeezed through the opening and dropped into the freezing November night. He landed in a crouch on the hard ground, his breath pluming in the frigid air, and for one terrible moment he almost turned back. Then he thought of Tommy's tear-streaked face, of Harlan's cruel smile, of Ethan being taken away, and he ran into the darkness without looking back, leaving the only home he had ever known, burning like a bad memory behind him. The town of Ridgeway sat 3 miles east of the orphanage, a collection of dim streetlights and shuttered buildings that Sile skirted like a fugitive, keeping to the shadows of the state highway, before plunging into the vast darkness of the open rangeland beyond. He had no plan beyond distance, beyond putting as many miles as possible between himself and the inevitable moment when someone would discover his empty bed and sound the alarm. The night had been cold but clear when he escaped, the sky a vast bowl of stars that offered neither warmth nor guidance. But within an hour of his flight, something shifted in the air. The wind, which had been a steady whisper across the grassland, suddenly gained teeth, tearing at his thin jacket with icy claws. Clouds rolled in from the north, thick and dark, blotting out the stars, and then the first snowflakes began to fall, fat and wet, melting against his face before the temperature dropped further, and they began to accumulate. Sile had heard the old-timers in town talk about Wyoming weather, how it could turn on you without warning, how early-season storms were the most dangerous because people weren't prepared, but hearing about it and experiencing it were 2 entirely different things. Within minutes, the gentle snowfall transformed into a blinding wall of white, the wind howling like a living thing, driving the snow horizontal across the empty land. He could barely see 10 feet in front of him, the beam of his small, stolen flashlight swallowed by the swirling chaos, and the cold that had been merely uncomfortable became a savage, penetrating force that seemed to reach through his clothes and wrap skeletal fingers around his bones. He pushed forward because stopping meant death, because the image of Director Harlan's face kept appearing in his mind like a demon in the storm, because he was 15 years old and terrified and had nowhere else to go. His fingers went numb first, then his toes, and soon he lost the ability to feel his face, his cheeks and nose burning with a fire that paradoxically signaled the approach of frostbite. Time lost all meaning in the white chaos. He might have been walking for 2 hours or 6, his internal compass completely shattered by the disorienting storm. He stumbled over unseen rocks, pushed through drifts that reached his knees, fell twice, and forced himself back to his feet through sheer stubborn will. The backpack on his shoulders felt like it was filled with stones, every step an agony of effort, his lungs burning with each breath of the knife-sharp air. The rational part of his mind, the part that was still functioning beneath the encroaching fog of hypothermia, understood that he was dying, that he had traded one form of death for another, that his frozen body would be found in the spring thaw, and Director Harlan would shake his head sadly at the funeral and call it a tragedy. His legs buckled beneath him, and he fell forward into the snow, the white coldness almost welcoming now, almost soft, and a dangerous warmth began to spread through his core, the deadly illusion of comfort that came in the final stages of freezing. He lay there, his cheek pressed against the snow, his eyes drifting closed, and thought of Ethan's laugh, of Tommy's small, frightened face, of all the things he would never experience now. Then, through the curtain of falling snow and gathering darkness, he saw it, a shape, angular and solid, the dark outline of buildings rising against the storm, like a mirage. His eyes struggled to focus, uncertain if this was real, or a hallucination conjured by his failing mind. But the shapes remained, distant but present, a promise of shelter. With the last reserves of strength he didn't know he possessed, Sile forced himself to his hands and knees, then to his feet, and began to stagger toward that impossible beacon of hope, each step a small miracle, his entire existence narrowed to the singular purpose of reaching those buildings before the night claimed him forever. The buildings resolved themselves from the storm's fury with agonizing slowness, each staggering step bringing them into sharper focus until Sile could make out the details through his snow-crusted eyelashes. A large two-story ranch house with a sagging porch, a massive barn listing slightly to one side, several smaller outbuildings scattered across what had once been an organized compound. Everything was painted in shades of grey and white, the structures themselves weathered to a silvery bleached color that spoke of years exposed to the merciless Wyoming sun and wind, now half buried in accumulating snow drifts. A wooden sign hung crookedly from a post near what had once been a gate, the words barely legible beneath layers of peeling paint and weather damage, but Sile could just make out the faded letters. Blackwater Ranch. The fence that had once marked the boundary of the property was broken in a dozen places, posts rotting and wire sagging into the snow, giving the entire place the appearance of a skeleton, picked clean by time and abandonment. Rusted farm equipment dotted the visible landscape, a tractor with grass growing through its engine compartment, a hay baler that had surrendered to entropy, all of it testimony to a life that had ended long ago. Sile's rational mind registered these details with the detached clarity of extreme hypothermia, understanding that this place had been deserted for years, that it offered shelter but not salvation. But his body no longer cared about such distinctions. He stumbled up the 3 steps to the front porch, nearly fell, when a rotted board gave way beneath his boot and threw his shoulder against the solid oak door. It held fast, locked or swollen shut, and he let out a sob of pure desperation, his frozen hands hammering uselessly against the unyielding wood. He moved along the porch, testing windows, and found one near the back that had a broken latch, its glass cracked but intact. With the last of his strength, he used his elbow to break through the remaining glass, reached inside to unlatch the frame, and hauled himself through the opening, falling in a graceless heap onto the floor inside. The absence of wind was immediate and profound, a cessation of the constant battering that made him want to weep with relief. And he lay there on the dusty wooden floorboards, his body shaking uncontrollably, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Slowly, as sensation began to return to his extremities in waves of excruciating pins and needles, he forced himself to look around. He was in what had once been a kitchen, a large room with empty counters and a cast-iron sink, cabinets hanging open to reveal nothing but shadows and mouse droppings, a thick layer of dust covering every surface, like a grey shroud. The place looked exactly as it should, abandoned, forgotten, a tomb of someone else's failed dreams. But as Sile's eyes adjusted to the darkness, illuminated only by the faint grey light filtering through the dirty windows, he began to notice inconsistencies that didn't fit the narrative of complete abandonment. There were boot prints in the dust on the floor, not the chaotic tracks he had just made, but a clear trail leading from the kitchen through a doorway into what looked like a main living area. The prints were recent, their edges sharp and clear rather than softened by settling dust. On the counter near the sink sat a ceramic coffee mug, its exterior relatively clean, with a faint dark ring inside that suggested recent use. Most telling of all, as he pulled himself to his feet and staggered toward the living room, he felt it. Warmth, faint but unmistakable, radiating from a pot-bellied wood stove in the corner, its metal sides still holding heat, even though no flame was visible through the grate. Someone had been here, and recently, perhaps within the last few hours. Someone was living in this ghost ranch, hiding in plain sight behind the facade of abandonment. And Sile had just stumbled into their secret world. Sile stood swaying on his feet, his eyes fixed on the wood stove and the impossible warmth it represented, when he heard the sound, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to emanate from the darkness of the hallway beyond the living room, a sound that froze his blood more effectively than the blizzard outside ever could. He spun around, his exhausted body moving on pure instinct, and saw the dog emerge from the shadows like a materialization of the storm itself. It was a German shepherd, large and powerfully built, but its coloring was unusual, a grizzled mix of grey and silver that made it look like a creature carved from stone and moonlight. The dog's ears were forward, alert, and its amber eyes held an intelligence that was almost human in its intensity, studying Sile with a watchful wariness that stopped just short of aggression. It moved into the room with a deliberate, measured pace, circling around Sile in a slow arc, maintaining a distance of about 6 feet, its head lowered slightly, and its body language communicating something complex. Not a threat, not exactly, but to assessment, a judgment being rendered. Sile remained perfectly still, his hands visible at his sides, his breathing shallow, every survival instinct he possessed screaming at him not to run, not to make any sudden movements that might trigger the dog's protective instincts. The shepherd completed its circle, positioned itself between Sile and the hallway, and sat, its tail sweeping once across the dusty floor, its gaze never leaving the boy's face. Then a voice cut through the tension, a voice that was rough with age and disuse, but carried an unmistakable authority. "Slate, easy boy, he's just a kid." Sile's eyes snapped to the darkened hallway, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst from his chest, and he watched as a figure stepped forward into the faint light. The man was old, in his 70s if Sile had to guess, but his body still held the upright posture of someone who had spent a lifetime working with his hands and his back. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, and lean in the way of men who had known genuine hardship, his frame carrying no excess weight, but still suggesting a wiry strength. His face was a road map of deep lines carved by sun and wind and time, his skin weathered to the color of old leather, and a thick grey beard covered his jaw and fell to his chest. His hair, equally grey and shot through with silver, was pulled back in a short ponytail, and he wore faded denim jeans, scuffed work boots, and a thick wool sweater that had seen better decades. But it was his eyes that captured Sile's attention and held it, pale blue, almost grey, the color of a winter sky, and despite the hard edges of his appearance, despite the obvious caution in his stance, there was a fundamental kindness in those eyes, a depth of understanding that spoke of someone who had seen terrible things and survived them without losing his humanity. The man moved slowly, keeping his hands visible in a mirror of Sile's own defensive posture, and stopped about 10 feet away, his gaze moving over the boy's snow-crusted clothing, his blue lips, his shaking hands. "You're about half frozen," the man said, his voice carrying a faint hint of an accent that might have been southern, softened by decades in Wyoming. "Sit down by the stove before you fall down." Sile wanted to speak, to explain, to apologize for the broken window and the intrusion, but his jaw was clenched so tight from the cold and the shaking that he couldn't form words. The man seemed to understand this without explanation. He moved to the wood stove, opened its metal door with a gloved hand, and began adding small pieces of kindling to the banked coals inside, coaxing them back to life with the practiced ease of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times. "My name is Thomas Blackwater," the man said, not looking at Sile as he worked, his tone conversational despite the strangeness of the situation. "And according to the county records and most folks in town, I've been dead for about 3 years now, which is exactly how I prefer to keep it." Thomas Blackwater didn't ask Sile where he came from, didn't demand to know why a 15-year-old boy was stumbling through a blizzard in the middle of the night, and most importantly, didn't reach for a phone to call the authorities. He simply pointed to a spot on the floor near the wood stove, laid out a thick wool blanket that smelled of cedar and age, and disappeared into the back of the house, returning moments later with a steaming bowl of soup that he placed on the floor beside Sile without a word. The soup was simple, canned chicken noodle heated on the wood stove, but to Sile's frozen, exhausted body, it tasted like the finest meal he had ever consumed, the warmth spreading through his core like liquid salvation. He ate in silence while Thomas settled into an old rocking chair on the opposite side of the room, Slate lying at his feet, both man and dog watching Sile with that same measured, assessing gaze. No words were exchanged that first night, The only sounds were the crackling of the fire, the howl of the wind outside, and the occasional creak of Thomas's rocking chair. When Syle's eyes finally began to close, despite his fear and uncertainty, when exhaustion pulled him down into a sleep so deep it felt like drowning, Thomas simply threw another log on the fire and continued his silent vigil. Morning came with a pale, cold light filtering through the dirty windows, the storm having blown itself out during the night, leaving behind a world buried under 2 feet of fresh snow. Syle woke to find Thomas already up, standing by the window and looking out at the transformed landscape, a cup of coffee in his weathered hands. The old man turned when he heard Syle stirring, his expression unreadable, and gestured for the boy to join him at a scarred wooden table in what had once been a dining area. Thomas set a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of Syle, poured him a cup of weak coffee, and then sat down across from him, his pale blue eyes sharp and penetrating in the morning light. "Here's how this works," Thomas said, his voice carrying the weight of non-negotiable terms. "The storm's passed, but there's 2 feet of snow out there, and more coming according to the weather. You can stay until you're strong enough, and the conditions are safe enough for you to leave. But if you stay, you work. I'm an old man, and this place needs more hands than I've got. You'll chop wood, you'll help with repairs, you'll do whatever needs doing without complaint." He paused, taking a long sip of his coffee, his gaze never leaving Syle's face. "Second rule, we don't ask questions. I don't ask where you came from or why you're running. And you don't ask why a dead man is living in an abandoned house. Our pasts are our own business. Understood?" Syle nodded, his throat too tight to speak, relief and gratitude and lingering fear warring in his chest. Thomas leaned forward, his expression hardening into something more serious, more urgent. "Third and most important, this ranch has eyes on it. There are people who want this land, powerful people who believe it's abandoned, and are just waiting for the right moment to take it legally. If anyone finds out I'm here, I lose everything. If anyone finds out you're here, they'll have questions neither of us can afford to answer. We stay invisible. We stay quiet. We leave no tracks that lead back to this house. You go outside. You cover your trail. You see a vehicle on the road. You hide. You keep the lights off after dark. And you never, ever let smoke from the chimney be visible during the day when someone might be watching." He sat back, his expression softening slightly. "Those are the terms. You can take them or you can leave, but you need to decide now." Syle looked at this strange, weathered man who had saved his life and was now offering him something he had never truly had: a choice, a chance, a temporary refuge from the chaos of the world. He thought of Director Harlan's cruel face, of the orphanage with its industrial smells and constant fear, of having nowhere else in the world to go, and he made the only decision he could. "I'll stay," Syle said, his voice rough but steady. "I'll work, and I'll stay invisible." Thomas nodded once, a gesture that sealed their unspoken agreement, and for the first time since Syle had arrived, the faintest hint of what might have been approval crossed the old man's weathered face. The days that followed established a rhythm that Syle had never experienced in his 15 years of institutional life, a pattern dictated not by bells and schedules and the arbitrary whims of authority figures, but by the sun's arc across the sky, the weather's demands, and the honest needs of survival. Thomas proved to be a patient but exacting teacher, a man who believed that if something was worth doing, it was worth doing correctly the first time. He taught Syle how to properly split firewood, not just swinging the axe with brute force, but understanding the grain of the wood, finding the natural fault lines, using leverage and precision rather than exhausting effort. They spent hours in the sheltered area behind the barn where Thomas kept his woodpile, the old man demonstrating the proper stance, the controlled swing, the satisfying crack when the log split cleanly in two. Syle's hands blistered and bled at first, the soft, uncalloused palms of someone who had never done real physical labor. But Thomas showed him how to wrap them, how to push through the pain, and gradually the blisters hardened into calluses, and the work became easier, almost meditative. Thomas revealed the hidden infrastructure of the ranch, the systems he had developed over 3 years of invisible habitation, a concealed root cellar beneath the barn where he stored food and supplies, a carefully designed path through the property that stayed out of sight from the main road, a series of observation points where he could watch for intruders without being seen. He taught Sile how to move through snow without leaving obvious tracks, walking in the shadows of fence lines and buildings, using branches to sweep away footprints when necessary, thinking always about sightlines and what a passing driver might glimpse from the distant road. The work was constant and physically demanding, from dawn until well after dark, repairing fence posts in the frigid mornings, clearing snow from the barn roof before the weight became dangerous, hauling water from the well that Thomas had kept secretly functional, maintaining the dozens of small systems that kept the ranch operating while appearing abandoned to the outside world. Through it all, Slate became Sile's shadow and companion, the grizzled German shepherd, seeming to sense the loneliness that lived in the boy's bones, the deep, aching need for connection that 7 years in the orphanage had carved into his soul. The dog would follow Siles on his tasks, sitting patiently while he worked, occasionally nudging his hand with a cold nose as if to offer encouragement, and at night would sleep beside his blanket near the fire, a warm, steady presence that asked nothing but offered everything. Kyle found himself talking to Slate during the long hours of work, sharing thoughts and fears he had never spoken aloud to any human, and the dog would listen with those intelligent amber eyes, his head cocked slightly, as if he understood every word. Thomas watched this developing bond with an expression that might have been approval, or might have been remembrance of something lost, but he never commented on it directly. What surprised Sile most was not the difficulty of the work or the harshness of the conditions, but the feeling that began to grow in his chest as the days turned into weeks. Purpose, a sense that his actions mattered, that he was building something rather than just surviving, that he was needed. At the orphanage, he had been a number, a problem to be managed, a mouth to be fed with the minimum required effort. But here on this ghost ranch with this ghost man and this loyal dog, he was essential. His hands and his strength making a real difference in the continued existence of this secret world. For the first time in his life, Sile Callahan felt like he belonged somewhere, and the realization was both terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. On the 4th week of Sile's stay, when the worst of the winter cold had settled into a steady, manageable rhythm, Thomas appeared at dawn with a backpack and a look of quiet determination that suggested something significant was about to happen. He handed Sile a thermos of hot coffee, gestured for Slate to follow, and set off walking toward the western edge of the property without explanation, leaving the boy no choice but to trail behind. They walked for over an hour through terrain that grew progressively rougher and more remote, climbing through stands of pine and juniper, following game trails that were barely visible beneath the snow, moving away from the ranch buildings until they were deep in the backcountry that Sile had not yet explored. Thomas moved with the sure-footed confidence of a man who had walked this path 1,000 times, never hesitating, never checking a map or landmark, and Slate ranged ahead like a scout, his nose to the ground, clearly familiar with their destination. The land began to change as they walked, the gentle rolling hills giving way to more dramatic formations, and suddenly they were at the entrance to a box canyon, a narrow cleft in the rock face that widened into a hidden valley beyond, the kind of natural formation that could exist for centuries without being discovered unless you knew exactly where to look. Thomas paused at the entrance, turned to Sile with an expression that was almost reverent, and said simply, "This is why I'm still here." They stepped through the narrow opening, and Syle's breath caught in his throat at what lay beyond. The box canyon was perhaps a quarter-mile across, sheltered on three sides by sheer rock walls that rose 100 feet into the air, with a small creek running through its center and winter-brown grass poking through the snow. But it was not the landscape that captured Syle's attention and held it with an almost physical force. It was the horses. There were 15 of them, and maybe 20, a small herd of wild mustangs moving through the canyon with a fluid grace that seemed to embody freedom itself. They were magnificent creatures, their winter coats thick and shaggy, their colorings ranging from deep bay to pale buckskin to a stunning paint with patches of brown and white. A large stallion, his coat the color of dark chocolate, stood watch on a small rise, his head high and his ears forward, monitoring the two humans and the dog with wary intelligence, but not panic, not the terror of animals unused to human presence, but rather the calculated wariness of creatures who had learned to coexist with a specific, trusted human. Thomas stood beside Syle, his weathered hands resting on a boulder, and began to speak in a voice thick with emotion, barely contained. "These are the last descendants of my grandfather's original herd, wild mustangs he brought to this ranch in 1947, when he started this place. They've lived in this canyon for 3 generations, protected and free. But the land developers who want this property, they see them as a problem, as wild animals that lower property values and interfere with their plans for luxury homes and golf courses." He paused, his jaw clenching, his pale blue eyes fixed on the horses. "They've tried to have them rounded up and sold, tried to claim they're a nuisance, tried every legal trick to eliminate them. And if I weren't here, if this place were truly abandoned like they think it is, they'd succeed." Syle watched the horses move, watched a young foal stay close to its mother's flank, watched 2 yearlings engage in playful mock battle, and felt something vast and aching open up in his chest. These creatures represented everything he had never had: freedom, family, a place to belong, roots that went deep into the earth and couldn't be easily severed. He understood in that moment that Thomas wasn't just protecting land or defending his home. He was safeguarding something sacred, a living connection to the past and a promise to the future. And Syle knew with absolute certainty that he would do whatever it took to help keep them safe. The outbuilding Thomas assigned to Syle was a small structure near the eastern fence line, little more than a storage shed with a slanted roof and walls made of weathered planks that let thin blades of winter light slice through the gaps. Thomas explained that it needed to be organized and made weatherproof before the next storm system moved through, and Syle set to work with the methodical approach he had learned over the past weeks, sorting through decades of accumulated debris, rusted tools, and forgotten equipment. It was in the back corner, behind a stack of rotting hay bales, that he found the water-damaged cardboard box, its sides soft and partially collapsed, the words, "Personal, do not touch," written in faded black marker across the top. Syle hesitated, remembering Thomas's rule about not asking questions about the past, but curiosity and the fundamental human need to understand the man who had saved his life won out, and he carefully pulled the box into the light. Inside was a treasure trove of history, fragments of a life that had been lived in full color before fading to the gray ghost existence Thomas now maintained. There were photographs, dozens of them, some in frames and some loose, showing a younger Thomas with a full dark beard standing in front of a thriving ranch, surrounded by hired hands and healthy cattle, the buildings behind him painted and proud, no hint of the decay that had claimed them now. Other photos showed a beautiful woman with kind eyes and long dark hair, her arm around Thomas's waist, both of them smiling with the easy confidence of people who believed the future belonged to them. There was a boy in later photos, growing from child to teenager to young man, with his mother's eyes and his father's strong jawline, and Syle realized with a pang that this must be Thomas's son, the one he had mentioned only in the briefest terms. Beneath the photographs were newspaper clippings, yellowed and brittle, and Sile read them with growing horror and understanding. The first was dated 15 years ago, a small article about a barn fire at the Blackwater Ranch that destroyed valuable equipment and killed several head of cattle. The cause listed as electrical malfunction. 6 months later, another article detailed contamination of the ranch's water supply, forcing a costly cleanup and dead livestock, the source described as undetermined but possibly natural seepage. The articles continued, a drumbeat of disaster, a fence collapse that let cattle onto a state highway, causing accidents and legal liability, a sudden property tax reassessment that tripled their annual burden, citations for violations that seemed designed to drain resources through legal fees. Then came the foreclosure notice, a larger article that detailed how the Blackwater Ranch, once a cornerstone of the local agricultural community, was being seized for unpaid debts and tax arrears, the Blackwater family having abandoned the property and relocated to parts unknown. But the article that stopped Sile's heart was dated 3 years ago, a half-page spread with a photograph of a young man in his 30s, handsome and intense, identified as Marcus Blackwater, environmental lawyer and son of Thomas Blackwater. The headline read, "Local attorney dies in single-vehicle accident." The article described how Marcus had been driving home from the county courthouse after filing an appeal on his family's foreclosure when his truck left the road at high speed, rolled multiple times, and burst into flames. The police report indicated alcohol was a factor, despite friends and colleagues insisting Marcus never drank. Sile sat back on his heels, the clippings trembling in his hands, understanding flooding through him with cold clarity. This hadn't been bad luck or misfortune. It had been a systematic campaign of destruction, a war fought with fire and sabotage and legal manipulation. And when the Blackwater family had fought back, when Marcus had tried to expose the truth, he had been silenced in the most permanent way possible. Thomas hadn't died 3 years ago. He had simply chosen to become a ghost, to fade into his own land where no one would look for him, protecting the last remnants of his family's legacy from the shadows, waiting perhaps for justice, or perhaps just for the end. The warning came from Slate, as it so often did, the dog's head snapping up from where he had been dozing in a patch of winter sunlight outside the barn, his ears forward, and a low growl building in his chest. Thomas, who had been showing Sile how to properly oil a set of old harness leather, froze immediately, his weathered hand going up in a gesture that commanded absolute silence. They listened, and after a moment, Sile heard it too, the distant sound of an engine, growing steadily louder, the low rumble of a heavy vehicle moving slowly along the main road that bordered the eastern edge of the property. Thomas moved with startling speed for a man in his 70s, grabbing Sile's arm and pulling him toward the back of the barn, his voice a harsh whisper. "Storm cellar, now, and don't make a sound." He led them to what appeared to be a solid section of the barn floor, knelt down, and with practiced efficiency, pulled up a section of weathered planking that Sile had walked over 100 times without realizing it was a concealed door. Beneath was a ladder leading down into darkness, and Thomas gestured urgently for Sile to descend, following immediately behind with Slate, pulling the false floor closed above them and plunging them into a blackness so complete it felt solid. They stood in the cramped underground space, barely large enough for the three of them, the air cold and smelling of earth and old stone, and above them, growing louder and more distinct, came the sound of the vehicle stopping, an engine idling, a door opening and closing. Sile's heart hammered against his ribs so loudly he was certain it would give them away, his breath coming in shallow gasps, and he felt Thomas's firm hand on his shoulder, a steadying pressure that communicated both warning and reassurance. Minutes stretched like hours as they listened to footsteps crunching in the snow above, moving around the barn, pausing, someone clearly surveying the property with careful attention. Then came the sound of a camera shutter, Multiple clicks, whoever was up there documenting the supposed abandonment, gathering evidence. Finally, mercifully, the footsteps retreated, the vehicle door closed, the engine revved, and the sound gradually faded into the distance. Thomas waited a full 10 minutes after the silence returned, before pushing open the trapdoor and allowing them to emerge back into the dim light of the barn. His face was grim, harder than Sile had ever seen it, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of long-held anger, barely contained. That was a county vehicle, probably from the land assessor's office, but they're not working for the county's interests, not really, Thomas said, moving to a crack in the barn wall where he could watch the road without being seen. There's a company called Apex Land Development, owned by a man named Richard Voss, and they've been circling this property like vultures for the past decade. They want this land because it sits on one of the best aquifers in the county and has perfect southern exposure for their planned luxury resort development, complete with golf courses, vacation homes, the whole obscene package. But there's a problem. The legal status of this ranch is murky, caught up in probate complications and unpaid tax liens, and Wyoming law is very specific about abandoned property. They can't just take it. They need clear proof that it's been genuinely abandoned for a continuous period, that no one is living here or maintaining it. That's why they do these drive-bys, taking photographs, documenting the decay, building their case. He turned to look at Sile, his pale blue eyes intense. If they ever find proof that someone is living here, that this ranch isn't actually abandoned, their whole carefully constructed legal strategy falls apart. But if we're discovered, I lose everything, and you get sent back to wherever you came from. So we stay hidden, we stay invisible, and we wait for them to make a mistake. The evenings became their time of unspoken truce, when the day's work was finished, and they would sit at the scarred wooden table with simple meals between them, the wood stove casting flickering shadows on the walls, and the silence that had once been awkward gradually transformed into something almost comfortable. It began with small things, fragments of truth traded like precious currency. Sile mentioning that he didn't know his parents, had been surrendered at birth, and Thomas nodding slowly, as if this explained something fundamental about the boy's wary eyes. Then one night, as they ate venison stew that Thomas had made from a deer he'd taken the previous autumn, Sile found himself speaking words he had never said aloud, describing Director Harlan's casual cruelty, the way fear had been the orphanage's primary currency, the sound of Tommy crying after being struck, and how Sile had known in that moment that if he stayed another day, he would either break completely or do something that would land him in juvenile detention. Thomas listened without interrupting, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug, and when Sile's voice finally trailed off into the crackling of the fire, the old man simply said, "Some people mistake power for strength, and children are easy targets for cowards, and somehow that simple acknowledgement meant more than any elaborate sympathy could have." The next evening, Thomas spoke of Marcus, his voice rough with a grief that 3 years had not diminished, describing a boy who had grown into a man of principle, who had studied law because he believed justice was possible, who had returned to Wyoming to fight for the ranch, not out of obligation, but out of love for the land and everything it represented. Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he described receiving the call about the accident, driving to the scene, and seeing his son's burned truck, knowing in his bones that Marcus had been murdered, but having no way to prove it, no allies in a system that had already decided the narrative. "I died that day, too," Thomas said, his pale blue eyes distant and haunted. "Not physically, but everything that made me who I was, that's when it ended, and becoming a ghost seemed like the only honest thing left to do." In the silence that followed, Sile reached across the table and placed his young, work-roughened hand over Thomas's gnarled, weathered one, and neither of them spoke. But something fundamental shifted between them, a recognition that they were both survivors of different wars, both carrying wounds that might never fully heal, but were somehow more bearable in shared company. After that night, Thomas's teaching expanded beyond the practical necessities of ranch maintenance into deeper territory, the kind of knowledge that was handed down through generations rather than learned from books. He taught Sile how to read weather in the behavior of animals and the smell of the wind, how to track deer by the subtle signs they left in their passage, how to identify edible plants, and which springs held the sweetest water. They would walk the property in the late afternoons, Slate ranging ahead, and Thomas would point out the stories written in the landscape, where his grandfather had built the first cabin in 1947, where his father had taught him to ride, where he and his late wife Sarah had scattered wildflower seeds that still bloomed every spring. He taught Sile the Shoshone names for landmarks that his grandfather had learned from the indigenous people who had walked this land long before any fence was raised, shared the knowledge that this wasn't just property, but a living history, a continuity of life and death and rebirth that humans were merely temporary custodians of rather than owners. Through it all, Sile felt himself changing, his shoulders broadening from the work, his hands growing capable and sure. But more than the physical transformation, he felt something deeper taking root, belonging, the sense that he was not just learning skills, but inheriting a legacy, becoming part of a story much larger than himself. And in Thomas's patient teaching and growing trust, he found something he had searched for his entire life without knowing its name. He found a father. The water damage in Thomas's bedroom ceiling had been growing worse with each winter storm, threatening to rot through the beams if left unattended, and on a cold February morning, they set to work repairing it, Sile holding the ladder, while Thomas inspected the leak's source from above. Slate had been lying in his usual spot by the door, but suddenly the dog rose to his feet, his ears forward, and began moving around the room with an intensity that made both man and boy stop their work to watch. The German Shepherd was fixated on a section of the floor near the bed, a spot that looked identical to every other weathered plank in the room. But Slate pawed at it insistently, whining with an urgency that was impossible to ignore, the same behavior he had exhibited in the kitchen when Sile had first arrived. Thomas climbed down from the ladder, his weathered face creased with confusion, and knelt beside the dog, running his hands over the floorboards. "I've lived in this house for 70 years, and never noticed anything unusual here," he muttered, but his fingers found what his eyes had missed. A barely perceptible seam, expertly concealed, forming a rectangle about 2 feet by 3 feet. Using a thin blade, Thomas pried at the edge, and with a soft click, a section of floor lifted up to reveal a hidden compartment lined with sheet metal. And inside that compartment was a fireproof document box, the kind used to protect important papers from disaster. Thomas's hands shook as he lifted it out, his face pale, and Sile saw recognition and pain flash across the old man's features. "This is Marcus's handwriting on the label," Thomas whispered, his voice thick with emotion, barely contained. They carried the box to the kitchen table, and Thomas opened it with reverence, as if unsealing a tomb. Inside was a carefully organized collection of documents that represented months or perhaps years of meticulous investigation. Original land deeds dating back to 1947, showing clear Blackwater ownership, water rights documentation proving the ranch controlled access to a major aquifer, geological surveys highlighting the property's value. But it was the thick manila folder labeled Evidence, Apex Development Criminal Activity that made Thomas's breath catch. Marcus had compiled everything. Bank records showing payments from Apex Development to county officials, including the fire inspector who had ruled the barn fire accidental, and the water quality supervisor who had blamed natural contamination. Copies of internal Apex emails discussing applying pressure to the Blackwater family and accelerating the timeline. Photographs of Apex contractors near the ranch on dates that corresponded with various accidents. Testimony from a whistleblower who described being paid to sabotage equipment and contaminate water supplies. There were engineering reports proving the luxury development would destroy the aquifer, environmental, impact studies that had been deliberately falsified, and most damning of all, a memo from Richard Voss himself outlining the strategy to force the Blackwaters into bankruptcy and make Marcus's opposition go away permanently. Thomas sat in silence, tears streaming down his weathered face into his grey beard, holding the proof that his son had died, not in a random accident, but as a murdered truth-teller. And Sile understood that they were no longer just hiding from the world, but holding evidence that could bring down an empire built on corruption and blood. Thomas sat at the table for a long time, his weathered hands resting on the evidence his son had died to compile. And when he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, as if the words were being pulled from somewhere deep and long-sealed within him. Marcus had been practicing environmental law in Denver, Thomas explained, making a good living representing conservation groups and indigenous tribes. But he had come home 5 years ago, when the foreclosure proceedings began, determined to save the family ranch, not just for sentimental reasons, but because he had discovered something that most people didn't understand. The Blackwater Ranch sat directly above the primary recharge zone for the Wind River Aquifer, the underground water source that supplied drinking water to 17,000 people across 3 counties. Apex Development's plans, which Marcus had obtained through legal discovery, called for excavating massive foundation systems for their luxury resort, drilling geothermal wells for heating and cooling, and installing a championship golf course that would require hundreds of thousands of gallons of water and constant chemical treatment to maintain the perfect green appearance that wealthy clients expected. Marcus had commissioned independent geological and hydrological studies that proved beyond any doubt that Apex's construction would fracture the aquifer's protective cap rock layer, allowing surface contaminants to seep directly into the underground water supply, and the golf course chemicals alone would create a toxic plume that would spread through the aquifer system within 5 years, poisoning wells across the entire valley for generations. He tried to do it the right way, Thomas said, his pale blue eyes fixed on his son's neat handwriting in the documents before him. He filed formal objections with the County Planning Commission, presented his evidence at public hearings, tried to get the EPA and State Environmental Office involved, but Apex had already bought everyone who mattered. The Planning Commission approved the development with a 7-0 vote. The Environmental Office declared the studies showed no significant impact, and the state EPA representative said Marcus's concerns were overblown and not supported by credible science, despite the fact that he had 3 PhD hydrologists backing his findings. Marcus had been driving home from the courthouse after filing an emergency injunction to halt the project when his truck left the road at high speed on a clear, dry night, rolled 4 times, and burst into flames with such intensity that the fire department later said it burned far hotter than any normal vehicle fire should. The official investigation took less than a week, concluding that Marcus had been driving drunk despite the fact that friends, colleagues, and Thomas himself testified that Marcus was a recovering alcoholic who hadn't touched a drop in 15 years, who attended AA meetings religiously, who kept a photo of his rock-bottom moment in his wallet as a reminder. The blood sample from the autopsy showed a blood alcohol level of 0.23, but Marcus's attorney had been preparing to challenge the results, claiming the sample had been tampered with, when he mysteriously dropped the case and left the state. "I should have fought," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "I should have taken this evidence and burned their world down. But I was broken. I was afraid, and I convinced myself that Marcus had died for nothing, that fighting them would just get me killed too and accomplish nothing." He had staged his own death, spread rumors through carefully placed hints that he had died of grief, and his body had been cremated in Denver and retreated into the shadows of his own land, becoming a ghost who protected what remained, but lacked the courage to seek justice, until a 15-year-old boy had stumbled through a blizzard and reminded him that sometimes survival isn't enough, that some truths demand to be spoken regardless of the cost. The silence that followed Thomas's story was heavy with the weight of impossible choices, and Sile sat across from the old man, his young mind racing through the implications of what they had discovered, understanding with a clarity that felt like ice water in his veins that they stood at a crossroads where every path led to loss. If they came forward with the evidence, if they exposed Apex Development's crimes and Marcus's murder, Thomas would lose his ghost existence, and the ranch would be flooded with investigators and media attention, and Sile himself would be discovered, identified as a runaway from Mountain View State Orphanage, and dragged back to Director Harlan's cruelty, or perhaps somewhere worse. But if they stayed silent, if they kept hiding in the shadows, while 17,000 people drank water that would soon be poisoned, if they let Marcus's death remain meaningless and his killers walk free, then what did that make them? Sile looked at the evidence spread across the table, at Thomas's grief-stricken face, and felt something solidify in his chest, a conviction that surprised him with its strength. "We have to tell someone," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "We have to bring this to the authorities, to someone who can stop them." Thomas's head snapped up, his pale blue eyes wide with fear, and something that might have been hope. "You don't understand what you're asking. If we do this, I lose everything. This ranch, my freedom, my ability to protect what's left of my family's legacy. And you, they'll find out who you are. They'll send you back to that place, or they'll charge me with harboring a runaway, and everything falls apart." Sile met his gaze without flinching. "Marcus died trying to protect people he didn't even know. He gave up everything for the truth. How can we do less? How can we hide here, knowing that families are going to get poisoned because we were too afraid to act?" The words hung in the air between them, and Thomas's weathered face crumpled, torn between the terror that had kept him alive for 3 years, and something else, something this strange, determined boy had awakened in him. "You remind me so much of him," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking. "You have his courage, his absolute certainty about right and wrong, and I can't lose you too. I can't watch another person I care about destroyed by doing the right thing." Sile stood and moved around the table, placing his work-roughened hand on Thomas's shoulder, the gesture of a son comforting a father. "Maybe this time it'll be different. Maybe this time the truth wins. But even if it doesn't, even if we lose everything, at least we'll lose it trying to do what Marcus would have wanted, what he died for. Isn't that worth something?" Thomas covered Sile's hand with his own, and in that moment, the frightened old man who had been hiding for 3 years made a decision that terrified him, but felt like coming back to life. Their decision to act hung in the air between them, theoretical and terrifying, but the universe had a way of forcing hands, and 2 days after their conversation, Slate provided the catalyst that transformed possibility into necessity. The dog had been resting on the porch in a rare patch of winter sunlight when he suddenly rose to his feet, his entire body going rigid, his head oriented toward the northeastern section of the property, where the land rose into a series of low hills that provided natural observation points. His growl was low and continuous, not the warning sound he made for wildlife, but the deeper, more menacing tone reserved for human threats. Thomas and Sile moved immediately to the concealed observation post Thomas had established in the barn's hayloft, a position that offered views of the property while keeping them invisible, and Thomas handed Sile the binoculars with hands that trembled slightly. Through the powerful lenses, Sile could see him clearly. A man in his 40s, dressed entirely wrong for the weather and terrain in a dark business suit and expensive overcoat, carrying a professional camera with a telephoto lens and what appeared to be a surveyor's tablet. He was methodically photographing the property from multiple angles, making detailed notes, taking GPS readings, documenting everything with the thorough precision of someone building an official record. The man spent nearly an hour on the hillside, close enough that Sile could see the Apex Development logo embroidered on his leather portfolio when he opened it to consult what appeared to be architectural plans. "They're preparing to break ground," Thomas whispered, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "That's a pre-construction site assessment. They're documenting current conditions, establishing baseline measurements, getting ready to bring in equipment and crews. He took the binoculars back, his weathered face pale. I've seen this before, right before they destroyed the Miller Ranch over in Carbon County. Once they start construction, once they begin excavating and drilling, it doesn't matter what evidence we have, the damage to the aquifer will already be done. Environmental lawsuits take years to work through the courts, and by the time any judge issues a stop work order, if they ever do, the contamination will have already begun. Sile felt his heart hammering against his ribs, understanding crystallizing with cold clarity. Their window for action wasn't weeks or months. It was days, perhaps hours. If Apex was conducting final site assessments, it meant permits had been approved, contractors hired, equipment scheduled. Marcus's evidence, 3 years hidden and protected, would become nothing more than proof of crimes already committed, rather than prevention of crimes about to occur. The man on the hillside finally packed his equipment and hiked back toward wherever he had parked his vehicle, disappearing into the tree line. But his presence had delivered a message more powerful than any words. The clock was ticking, and their time for hiding, for debating, for fear, had run out. That evening, as they sat at the table with Marcus's evidence spread before them, like a map to an impossible destination, Sile laid out his plan with a certainty that belied his 15 years, his hazel eyes intense in the firelight, as he explained the logic that had been forming in his mind since they spotted the Apex surveyor. Marcus's notes mentioned a federal EPA investigator named Sarah Chen, someone Marcus had been in contact with before his death, someone he had trusted enough to share preliminary findings with, and according to the documents, she was based out of the regional office in Casper, just 40 miles from the nearest town of Millbrook. Sile proposed that he would make the journey, hiking the back country to avoid roads where Thomas might be recognized, carrying copies of the most critical evidence, and making contact with Agent Chen to bring the federal government into the fight before Apex could begin construction. Thomas reacted as if Sile had suggested walking into a forest fire, his weathered face draining of color, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles went white. "Absolutely not," he said, his voice shaking with barely controlled fear. "I've already lost everyone I ever cared about to this fight. I won't lose. You too. I can't watch another person I love walk into danger because of this cursed land, and my family's stubborn refusal to just let it go." The words hung between them, the admission of love unexpected and raw, and Sile felt his throat tighten with emotion, but pushed forward anyway. "That's exactly why I have to go," he argued, leaning forward with an intensity that matched Thomas's fear. "You can't show your face in town. Everyone thinks you're dead. And if you suddenly appear, it'll raise questions that'll bury us before we even start. But me? I'm nobody. I'm just a runaway kid that the system probably stopped looking for weeks ago. I can move through Millbrook without anyone giving me a second glance, get to a phone, contact Agent Chen, and be back before anyone realizes I was there." Thomas stood abruptly, pacing the small kitchen like a caged animal, Slate's concerned eyes tracking his movement. "You're 15 years old. Marcus was 32, a trained lawyer who knew how to protect himself. And they still killed him. What chance do you have against people who murder anyone who threatens their profits?" Sile met the old man's desperate gaze with calm determination. "Marcus went alone, and everyone knew what he was doing. But I'll be invisible, one more homeless kid in a town that probably has dozens, and by the time anyone realizes what's happened, Agent Chen will already have the evidence and federal protection. It's not about courage, Thomas. It's about being smart, and right now, I'm the only weapon we have that they won't see coming." They prepared through the night with the grim efficiency of soldiers before a mission, Thomas selecting the most damning documents from Marcus's evidence and making careful copies on the old photocopier he kept hidden in the basement, choosing pieces that were irrefutable but small enough to carry without burden. Bank records showing the bribes, the internal Apex emails discussing sabotage, the hydrological reports proving the development would poison the aquifer, and photographs of Apex contractors at the ranch on dates matching the various accidents. He packed them in waterproof bags and sealed them inside a small backpack, along with high-energy food, a water filter, matches, a compass, and a detailed hand-drawn map that showed every creek, ridgeline, and landmark between the ranch and the town of Clearwater, 20 miles to the southeast. Thomas went over the route 3 times, his weathered finger tracing the path through the backcountry, avoiding roads and populated areas, following game trails and natural corridors that would keep Sile invisible to any watchers, his voice steady and professional as he explained which springs had safe water and which meadows to avoid because they were visible from distant roads, but his pale blue eyes betrayed the terror he was working so hard to contain. Dawn came cold and clear, and they stood together on the porch, Slate between them, sensing the significance of the moment, and Thomas placed both hands on Sile's shoulders, looking at the boy who had become a son in the space of 2 months, with an expression that held love and fear and desperate hope in equal measure. "You come back to me," Thomas said, his voice breaking on the words. "You deliver that evidence, you get help, and then you come back, because this place, it's your home now, and I need you here." Sile nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat, and then he shouldered the backpack, gave Slate the signal to follow, and walked away from the only home he had ever truly known, without looking back, because he knew if he looked back, he might not have the strength to leave. The journey was everything Thomas had warned, and more. Steep climbs through snow-choked ravines, careful navigation across frozen streams, where one wrong step meant a plunge into water cold enough to kill in minutes, endless miles of forest, where every shadow seemed to hold a threat, and every sound made his heart race with the possibility of discovery. Slate was his anchor and his guide, the dog's superior senses alerting him to dangers before they materialized, leading him around a hunting camp where men with rifles would have asked questions, steering him away from a road where a county vehicle was parked as if waiting. They slept the first night in a small cave Thomas had marked on the map, Sile huddled against Slate's warm body for heat, too afraid to risk a fire, and set out again before dawn, pushing through exhaustion and fear until finally, as the sun set on the second day, the lights of Clearwater appeared in the valley below, like a constellation of hope. Clearwater hit Sile like a physical assault after 2 months of silence and isolation, the noise of traffic and voices and music bleeding from storefronts, overwhelming his senses that had grown attuned to wind and birdsong and the quiet creak of old buildings. He walked down Main Street with Slate at his side, drawing curious glances from passers-by, who saw a thin teenager with haunted eyes and a magnificent grey dog, both looking like they had walked out of the wilderness itself, which was exactly what they had done. He found the federal building using directions from a gas station attendant, who had looked at him with concern and offered to call social services, an offer Sile had declined with practiced evasiveness before hurrying away. The building was a bland, concrete structure that housed multiple agencies, and he searched the directory with trembling fingers until he found it. Environmental Protection Agency, Regional Field Office, Agent S. Chen, Room 304. The elevator ride felt surreal, the fluorescent lights harsh after weeks of firelight and dawn, and when he knocked on the door marked 304, his heart was hammering so hard he thought it might burst through his ribs. The woman who answered was in her late 30s, of Chinese descent, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind practical glasses, and an expression that shifted from mild annoyance at the interruption to concern as she took in Sile's appearance. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone trained to deal with traumatized individuals. "Are you Agent Sarah Chen?" Sile asked, his voice cracking. "I have evidence about Apex Development and the Blackwater Ranch, evidence that Marcus Blackwater compiled before he died, and I need your help." The transformation in her expression was immediate and profound, shock and disbelief and something that might have been grief crossing her face in rapid succession. She pulled Sile into her office, closed the door, made him sit, brought him water and a sandwich from her desk drawer. And with Slate lying protectively at his feet, Sile opened the backpack and spread Marcus's evidence across her desk. Agent Chen went through each document with the practiced eye of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at, her hands shaking slightly as she read the bank records, the emails, the hydrological reports, and when she finally looked up at Sile, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Marcus contacted me 3 years ago with preliminary findings," she said quietly. "We were building a federal case, but after his death, all his evidence disappeared, and without it, we had nothing solid enough to move forward. Where did you find this, and where is Thomas Blackwater?" Siles told her everything, the words spilling out in a desperate rush, and Agent Chen listened with growing alarm, finally leaning forward with an expression of deep concern. "I'll open an immediate investigation and request federal protection for the ranch, but you need to understand that Apex Development is owned by people with serious political connections. They've already killed to protect this project, and the moment they realize this evidence has resurfaced, they'll do everything in their power to stop it. Which means you and Thomas are in grave danger." Agent Chen had insisted that Sile wait at the federal building while she mobilized a team, but every instinct in his body screamed that time was a luxury they no longer possessed, and so he had slipped out while she was making urgent phone calls, Slate at his heels, and they ran through the streets of Clearwater toward the wilderness beyond, retracing their path with desperate speed. The return journey that had taken 2 careful days, he attempted to compress into one brutal forced march, pushing his 15-year-old body beyond exhaustion, ignoring the burning in his lungs and the screaming protest of his legs, driven by a terrible certainty that something had gone catastrophically wrong. He saw the smoke first when they crested the ridge overlooking the valley where the ranch lay hidden, a thin grey column rising into the afternoon sky, and his heart stuttered with terror before his mind registered that it was too small to be the ranch itself burning, more like a signal fire or a warning. They descended, the ridge at a reckless pace, Slate running ahead with his ears flat and his body low, both of them sensing the wrongness that permeated the air, like an electric charge before a lightning strike. The fresh tire tracks were impossible to miss, deep ruts in the snow leading right up to the ranch buildings, multiple vehicles that had arrived with no attempt at concealment, and the front door of the house hung open on broken hinges, swaying slightly in the wind, like a mouth frozen in a scream. Sile entered with his heart in his throat, calling Thomas's name into the violated silence, and found chaos. Furniture overturned, cabinets yanked open, and their contents scattered. The hidden compartment beneath the hearth pried open and emptied, everything systematic and thorough, the work of professionals searching for something specific. The smoke was coming from a small fire in the yard, and when Sile approached it, he found the source. Photographs of Thomas, recent surveillance photos showing him working around the ranch, proof that his ghost existence had been discovered and documented. It was a message, clear and terrifying. "We know you're alive, we know you've been here, and we have you now." Slate had not entered the house, but was ranging in wide circles around the property, his nose to the ground, and suddenly he stopped, let out a sharp bark, and took off running toward the eastern boundary, following a scent trail that was invisible to human senses, but clear as a highway to the dog's powerful nose. Sile ran after him, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders, the evidence inside it suddenly feeling like a hollow victory. Because what did justice matter if Thomas was already dead, if Sile had traded the only father he had ever known for the chance to expose criminals who seemed untouchable? Slate led them east for nearly 2 miles, across the property boundary, and into land that Thomas had described as recently purchased by Apex Development, following a scent trail that wound through dense forest until they emerged at the edge of an abandoned mining camp, a collection of weathered buildings and rusted equipment that dated back to the 1950s, now clearly being used as a staging area for the coming construction project, based on the new equipment and fresh tire tracks visible everywhere. Sile approached with caution, using the cover of the buildings to move closer. And through a grimy window of what had once been the mining office, he saw them. Thomas, bound to a chair with zip ties, his weathered face blooded but defiant, and 3 men standing around him, 2 large thugs in tactical gear who had the look of hired muscle, and a third figure that made Sile's blood turn to ice in his veins. Director Harlan stood with his back to the window, his thick shoulders and balding head unmistakable even from behind, his voice carrying through the thin walls with that same condescending tone that had haunted Sile's nightmares. "I have to hand it to you. Blackwater, hiding in plain sight for 3 years, is impressive. But you made one critical mistake. You took in my runaway, and the moment I saw that police bulletin with his description, I knew exactly where the little rat had gone." Harlan moved into Sile's line of sight, and the cruel smile on his face was exactly as remembered, the expression of a man who enjoyed having power over others. "You see, I've been on Apex's payroll for 7 years now, ever since Richard Voss realized that an orphanage director has access to all sorts of useful resources, kids who can be convinced to run errands, social workers who can be bribed to look the other way, connections throughout the state welfare system that make certain problems disappear. It's been quite profitable, and when that bulletin came through us about Sile Callahan running away, something about the timing and location made me curious, so I did some digging, asked around, and discovered rumors about strange activity at the supposedly abandoned Blackwater ranch." Thomas spat blood onto the floor, his pale blue eyes blazing with contempt. "You're a piece of human garbage, using vulnerable children for your criminal enterprise." Harlan backhanded him casually, the crack of the blow making Sile flinch behind his concealment. "Save your moral superiority, old man. The boy's probably dead in the woods by now, frozen or starved, which solves one problem, and you're going to tell us where the rest of Marcus's evidence is hidden, or we'll make your final hours very unpleasant before staging another tragic accident." Outside, pressed against the cold wall with Slate's warm body against his leg, Sile felt rage and terror warring in his chest, understanding that he was watching the 2 greatest threats in his life converge into a single nightmare, and he had to make an impossible choice about what to do next. Sile was still trying to formulate a plan, his mind racing through possibilities that all seemed to end in disaster, when Slate made the decision for him, the dog letting out a single sharp bark that shattered the silence and brought all 3 men spinning toward the window. Before Sile could retreat, the door burst open, and one of the thugs had him by the arm, dragging him inside and throwing him to the floor in front of Thomas's chair, and the look of anguished horror on the old man's face was worse than any physical blow Sile had ever received. Harlan's expression transformed from surprise to a smile of pure, malicious satisfaction, and he actually laughed, a sound that made Sile's skin crawl with remembered fear and fresh terror. "Well, well, the prodigal son returns," Harlan said, circling Sile like a predator enjoying the hunt. "You've led us on quite a chase, boy, but it ends now, and I'm prepared to offer you a deal, because, despite what you might think, I'm not an unreasonable man." He gestured to Thomas with an expansive wave. "Come back to Mountain View quietly. No fuss, no drama. Tell the authorities that you ran away because you were confused and scared, that this man had nothing to do with your disappearance, and we'll release him unharmed, let him go back to his ghost existence until nature takes its course." The offer hung in the stale air of the mining office, superficially generous, but laced with poison, and Sile's mind worked through the implications with painful clarity. If he refused, Harlan would call the police, charge Thomas with kidnapping a minor, destroying any credibility the evidence might have by painting Thomas as a criminal who had manipulated a vulnerable child, turning their entire fight into a pathetic story of a delusional old man's conspiracy theories. Thomas's voice cut through Sile's spiraling thoughts, strong despite the blood on his face and the zip ties cutting into his wrists. Don't you dare, boy. Don't you dare throw away your freedom for me. I'm an old man who's already lost everything that mattered, but you've got your whole life ahead of you. You've got Agent Chen waiting with the evidence. You run. You run right now, and you don't look back." The words were a command and a plea, and a father's desperate attempt to save his son. But Sile felt his legs refuse to move, felt the weight of abandonment that had defined his entire existence pressing down on him, because every person he had ever mattered to had left him, given him up, walked away, and he could not, would not, add Thomas to that list of people who had vanished from his life. "I'm not running," Sile said, his voice shaking, but determined, meeting Harlan's cold eyes with defiance he didn't fully feel. "I'll go back with you, if you let him go. But I want to see him walk out of here first. I want your word that you won't hurt him." Harlan's smile widened, victorious and cruel, already reaching for his phone to make the call that would seal Sile's fate, when the sound of helicopters suddenly filled the air, growing louder with each passing second, and through the grimy windows they could see vehicles with federal markings pouring into the mining camp, and Agent Sarah Chen's voice amplified through a megaphone, declaring, "FBI, nobody move, you are all under arrest." And the devil's bargain dissolved into chaos as the walls of Apex Development's carefully constructed conspiracy came crashing down around them. The sound of helicopters and the sight of federal vehicles should have ended everything cleanly. But chaos has its own momentum, and in the split second between Agent Chen's amplified command and the reality of armed federal agents closing in, Harlan's expression transformed from victorious smugness to trapped animal desperation, and he made the worst decision of his life, shouting at his men to grab the boy, to use him as leverage, to create a hostage situation that might buy them time, or clemency, or some impossible escape. The two thugs moved toward Sile with grim efficiency, their hands reaching for him, and that was when Slate, who had been forced to remain outside during the initial confrontation, but had been circling the building with growing agitation, crashed through the already broken window in an explosion of fur and fury. 85 pounds of protective rage, moving with a speed and violence that was absolutely terrifying to witness. The dog hit the first thug like a missile, his powerful jaws clamping onto the man's forearm with enough force to snap bone. The scream that followed, high-pitched and agonized, and in the chaos of that moment, Thomas, with a strength born of pure, desperate will, wrenched his arms forward and snapped the zip ties that had been biting into his wrists, the plastic giving way after hours of subtle sawing against the chair's rough wood. "Sile! The ATV outside! Go now!" Thomas roared, his voice cutting through the pandemonium, and Sile didn't think, didn't hesitate. He just ran towards the door as the second thug tried to intercept him. But Slate was already there, releasing the first man and launching himself at the new threat, his teeth bared and his growl a sound from some primal nightmare. Sile burst out into the cold air, where 3 ATVs were parked, keys still in the ignitions, because the men had expected to be here only briefly, and he threw himself onto the nearest one, his hands finding the controls through muscle memory from the times Thomas had let him practice on the ranch's old four-wheeler. The engine roared to life. Slate leapt onto the back rack with practiced ease, and Sile twisted the throttle, the ATV lurching forward, just as the sharp crack of gunfire split the air behind him. One shot, then two, then a ragged volley that might have been Harlan or his men, or the arriving federal agents returning fire. He couldn't tell and couldn't stop to find out. Terror gripped him with physical force, his mind screaming that Thomas was back there, that the old man might be hit, might be dying, might be sacrificing himself so Sile could escape. But Thomas's final command echoed in his head with the force of holy law. Protect the land, protect the truth, get back to the ranch and make sure everything Marcus died for wasn't lost in the chaos of this final confrontation. He drove like a demon through the forest, following game trails and instinct, the ATV bouncing over rocks and fallen logs, Slate's weight a steadying presence on the back, and the sound of helicopters overhead grew louder. Multiple aircraft now, the full weight of federal response descending on the mining camp. He didn't slow down, didn't look back, just kept the throttle wide open, branches whipping at his face and arms, his entire being focused on reaching the ranch, on being the keeper of Marcus's legacy, on honoring the sacrifice that Thomas might have just made for him. And behind him the gunfire faded into the distance, but the echo of it would ring in his nightmares for years to come. The terrible not knowing whether the only father he had ever loved was alive or dead. Sile reached the ranch as the sun was setting, the ATV sliding to a stop in the yard, and he jumped off with Slate at his heels, his mind still reeling from the gunshots and the terrible uncertainty of Thomas's fate. But survival instinct took over. The training Thomas had drilled into him over 2 months of hard living, asserting itself through the fog of panic. He remembered Thomas's words from weeks ago, spoken almost casually during one of their evening meals. "If everything goes to hell and we get separated, there's an emergency radio in the storm cellar beneath the barn, military grade, solar powered. It can reach federal frequencies, and it's our last line of communication with the outside world." Sile ran to the barn, threw open the concealed trapdoor, and descended into the cramped underground space, his flashlight beam finding the radio exactly where Thomas had described it. A ruggedized military unit with a solar panel array that Thomas had kept charged and maintained. His hands shook as he powered it on, adjusted the frequency to the emergency band Agent Chen had given him during their meeting, and pressed the transmit button. "Agent Chen, this is Sile Callahan. Do you copy? Over." Static, then her voice, tense but clear. "Sile, where are you? What's your status?" He gave her the ranch coordinates, explained that Thomas had been taken, that there had been gunshots at the mining camp, that he had escaped but didn't know if Thomas was alive, and her response sent ice through his veins. "We have Thomas. He's injured but stable, being airlifted to Casper Regional. But Sile, you need to listen carefully. Harlan and 2 of his men escaped in the confusion. They're armed, and we believe they're heading to the ranch to destroy any remaining evidence. Before we can secure it, Federal Response Team is en route to your location, but it's going to take at least 2 hours to get there. You need to hide. Stay out of sight. Do not engage them." Sile looked around the storm cellar, at the cramped space that would be a tomb if they found him here, and made a decision that Thomas would have understood. He wasn't hiding. He was defending, because this ranch was his home, and the evidence of Marcus's murder was still here, and he would be damned if he let Harlan destroy it. He signed off with Agent Chen, climbed out of the cellar, and began to prepare the ranch for siege, using every survival skill and tactical lesson Thomas had taught him over the long winter evenings. He scattered broken glass beneath the windows, creating noise traps that would alert him to entry attempts. He positioned Thomas's hunting rifle at a vantage point in the barn's hayloft, with a clear view of the approaches. He scattered tools and obstacles in strategic locations to slow any advance through the buildings. He moved through the property with Slate at his side, thinking like Thomas had taught him to think, using the terrain and structures not as a place to hide, but as weapons to be deployed. And as the last light faded from the sky and darkness settled over the ranch, he heard them coming. The rumble of a vehicle approaching without headlights, moving slowly up the access road, and Harlan's voice carrying through the cold night air, shouting that the boy had nowhere to run, that this ended tonight. And Sile took up his position in the hayloft, checked the rifle's chamber, and waited with Slate silent beside him. A 15-year-old boy preparing to make a stand for the only home he had ever known. The universe has a sense of irony, and as Harlan and his 2 remaining men spread out to search the ranch buildings, the wind that had been a mere whisper suddenly gained teeth, and the first snowflakes began to fall, tentative at first, but quickly intensifying into the kind of early spring blizzard that the old-timers said was more dangerous than midwinter storms, because people forgot to respect them. Within 20 minutes, the world transformed into the same white chaos that had nearly killed Sile 2 months ago. But this time, he wasn't a desperate runaway, stumbling blindly through the cold. He was a boy who had learned this land's secrets, who had walked every inch of this property with Thomas, who knew which buildings had hidden exits and which fence lines provided cover, and where the terrain dropped away into dangerous ravines that were invisible in the blinding snow. Sile used the storm like a weapon, leading Harlan's men on a chase through conditions that terrified him, but terrified them more, moving through the blizzard with Slate at his side, the dog's superior senses guiding him when visibility dropped to mere feet, his grey and silver coat making him nearly invisible against the swirling snow. He led them first to the eastern pasture, where he knew the ground was treacherous, pocked with hidden gopher holes and uneven terrain, hearing one of the men cry out as his ankle twisted in a concealed depression, the sound of pain carrying through the wind. Then he doubled back, using a route through the dense pine grove that only someone who had walked it 100 times could navigate in these conditions, emerging behind the barn while the men were still searching the far side of the property, buying himself precious minutes to catch his breath and plan his next move. Harlan was screaming orders that were half swallowed by the wind, his voice carrying frustration and rage, and Sile could hear them spreading out, trying to surround him. But they were thinking like hunters in a normal environment, not understanding that in a blizzard like this, the property became a labyrinth where every landmark disappeared and every direction looked the same. Sile led them to the box canyon, the place where the mustangs sheltered, knowing the narrow entrance was nearly impossible to find in good weather and absolutely invisible in these conditions, and he slipped through the cleft in the rocks with Slate while hearing the men stumble past in the white darkness, their flashlight beams useless against the horizontal sheets of snow. The horses were there, huddled against the canyon wall for protection, and they recognized Sile and Slate, didn't spook or flee, and for a moment he pressed his freezing face against the warm neck of the old stallion, drawing strength from the living connection to everything Thomas loved about this land. But exhaustion was catching up with him, the adrenaline that had sustained him through the escape and the preparation, and now this deadly chase beginning to fade, his 15-year-old body pushed beyond its limits, his hands so cold he could barely feel them, his legs shaking with fatigue, and he knew with terrifying clarity that he couldn't keep this up much longer, that eventually he would make a mistake or his strength would simply fail. He emerged from the canyon using the back route Thomas had shown him, the one that required climbing over a rock face that was treacherous even in good conditions and nearly suicidal in the storm. But Sile made the climb because he had no choice, because giving up meant Harlan won, meant Marcus died for nothing, meant Thomas's sacrifice was wasted. At the top, he could see lights in the distance, multiple sets of headlights fighting through the storm, and he realized with a sob of relief that it was the Federal Response Team, arriving early, perhaps having pushed their vehicles beyond safe limits to reach him, and he started moving toward those lights, toward salvation, when a hand grabbed his ankle from below and he looked down to see Harlan himself, having followed him up the rock face, the director's face a mask of rage and determination, and the man was pulling himself up, one hand reaching for the gun at his belt, and Sile understood that, even with rescue minutes away, Harlan would take his revenge, and Slate, sensing the mortal threat, lunged forward with a final burst of protective fury that sent all three of them tumbling backward into the snow-filled darkness. The tumble down the rock face should have killed them, but the deep snow drifts at the base provided a brutal cushion that left them battered and gasping. But alive, Sile lying on his back, staring up at the grey pre-dawn sky, Harlan a few feet away, struggling to rise, and Slate standing between them, his grey fur matted with snow, his teeth bared in a final warning that transcended any remaining strength he possessed. Sile tried to move, tried to push himself up, but his body had simply reached its limit. 2 months of hard labor, followed by a 2-day journey, followed by another desperate flight, and now this final confrontation, draining every reserve he possessed. And he could only watch as Harlan found his gun in the snow, raised it with shaking hands, his face twisted with a hatred so profound it had crossed into madness. and Sile closed his eyes, not in surrender, but in a kind of peace, knowing he had done everything he could, that Marcus's evidence was safe, that Thomas was alive, and that was enough. That was more than most people got. The sound that saved him wasn't the crack of a gunshot, but the thunderous roar of rotor blades, multiple helicopters cresting the ridge as the storm finally began to break, the first pale light of dawn cutting through the thinning clouds, and searchlights from above suddenly illuminated the scene in brilliant white light that turned the snow-covered landscape into something almost celestial. Harlan's gun hand wavered, his eyes squinting against the sudden glare, and before he could decide whether to shoot or run or surrender, figures in tactical gear were rappelling from the helicopters, federal marshals moving with military precision, their weapons trained, and their voices commanding him to drop his weapon, to get on the ground, to give up because there was nowhere left to run. Agent Chen was in the second helicopter, and as it landed in the clearing near the barn, Sile saw a figure emerge beside her, moving slowly with one arm in a sling and bandages visible beneath his heavy coat, but unmistakably, impossibly, wonderfully alive. Thomas Blackwater, his weathered face showing new lines of pain, but his pale blue eyes scanning the chaos until they found Sile lying in the snow, and the old man's expression crumpled with relief so profound it was almost grief. The next hours were a blur of warmth and medical attention and gentle questions, paramedics wrapping Sile in thermal blankets and checking him for frostbite and hypothermia, Agent Chen coordinating the arrest of not just Harlan, but a dozen Apex development executives who were being taken into custody simultaneously across 3 states based on the evidence Marcus had compiled, and the new charges of kidnapping and attempted murder that Sile's ordeal had added to the case. Thomas sat beside Sile in the helicopter during the flight to the hospital, his good hand gripping the boy's shoulder. No words necessary between them, because some bonds transcended language. And through the window, Sile could see the ranch below, small and vulnerable, but still standing, still home. And Agent Chen leaned forward to tell them that the Justice Department was already moving to restore the property to Thomas legally, that the foreclosure had been based on falsified documents and coordinated harassment that multiple federal judges were prepared to overturn, that everything Marcus had fought for, everything he had died trying to protect, was finally being made right. Spring came to the Blackwater Ranch like a resurrection, the winter snow melting to reveal earth that had been waiting patiently for renewal, and with it came transformation that went far beyond the changing of seasons. The buildings that had been deliberately maintained in a state of apparent decay were now openly repaired, fresh paint on the barn doors, new shingles on the main house roof, fences standing straight and strong. All of it legal now, all of it protected by federal conservation easements and court orders that had restored Thomas Blackwater's ownership and made the property untouchable by the corporate vultures who had circled it for so long. Richard Voss and 6 Apex development executives were awaiting trial on charges ranging from environmental crimes to murder conspiracy. Director Harlan was in federal custody, facing decades in prison, and the Mountain View State Orphanage had been shut down pending a complete investigation, its remaining children placed in better facilities where people like Agent Chen would personally ensure they were treated with the dignity and care they deserved. The Mustang herd in the Box Canyon had been granted federal protection status, their bloodline recognized as historically significant, and their habitat designated as permanently preserved, which meant Thomas's grandfather's legacy would continue long after Thomas himself was gone, wild horses running free on land that would never be subdivided into luxury lots or poisoned by golf course chemicals. Sile stood on the porch in the early morning light, no longer the terrified 15-year-old who had stumbled through a blizzard, but still 15, still learning, still carrying scars, both visible and invisible. But different now in ways that mattered, his shoulders broader from honest work, his hands calloused and capable, his eyes no longer holding that haunted wariness of an animal expecting to be hurt. The legal papers that Agent Chen had helped expedite sat framed on the mantel inside. Thomas Blackwater named as legal guardian, Sile Callahan's last name officially changed to Blackwater by court order, all of it stamped and sealed, and real in a way that made Sile's throat tight every time he looked at it, because he had a family now, he had a father, he had a name that meant something beyond a number in a state system. Thomas emerged from the house, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee, moving more slowly than he had before the bullet wound to his shoulder, but alive and recovering, and more present somehow, as if nearly losing everything had reminded him what living actually meant. He handed Sile one of the mugs and stood beside him, Slate settling at their feet with the contentment of a dog who knew his pack was complete and safe, and together they watched the sun rise over the eastern ridge, painting the valley in shades of gold and pink that seemed to promise that better days were not just possible, but inevitable. Thomas placed his weathered hand on Sile's shoulder, the gesture both casual and profound, the touch of a father claiming his son, and said quietly, "Your room needs another bookshelf, and I was thinking we'd start working with the horses next month, teach you to ride properly, if you're interested." And Sile felt something break open in his chest, something that had been locked and frozen since the day he was born and abandoned, the realization washing over him with the warmth of the morning sun that this was home, not the buildings or the land, but this moment, this connection, this absolute certainty that he belonged somewhere and to someone, and that no Director Harlan or corporate conspiracy or twist of fate could ever take that away from him again because he hadn't just found shelter on an abandoned ranch or stumbled into someone else's fight. He had found the family he never knew he needed, and in saving them, in being brave enough to fight for the truth even when it terrified him, he had saved himself. And that made all the difference.